Part 3. 1753. 6 years later. 7th of June, 1753. 1. "I have a job for you," said Reginald. I nodded, expecting as much. It had been a long time since I'd last seen him, and I'd had the feeling that his request to meet wasn't just an excuse to catch up on tittle-tattle, even if the venue was White's, where we sat supping an ale each, an attentive and, it hadn't escaped my notice, buxom waitress keen to bring us more. To the left of us a table of gentlemen, the infamous gamesters of White's, were playing a rowdy game of dice, but otherwise the house was empty. I hadn't seen him since that day in the Black Forest 6 years ago, and a lot had happened since. Joining Braddock in the Dutch Republic, I'd served with the Coldstreams at the siege of Bergen-op-Zoom, then until the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle the following year, which marked the end of that war. After that I'd remained with them on several peacekeeping campaigns, which had kept me away from Reginald, whose correspondence arrived either from London or from the chateau in the Lons forest. Aware that my own letters could be read before they were sent, I'd kept my correspondence vague while privately looking forward to the moment I could at last sit down with Reginald and talk over my fears. But returning to London, and once again taking up residence at Queen Anne's Square, I found he was not available. That was what I was told. He had been sequestered with his books, he and John Harrison, another Knight of the Order, and one who seemingly was as obsessed with temples, ancient storehouses, and ghostly beings from the past as he was. "Do you remember we came here for my 8th birthday?" I said, wanting somehow to put off the moment when I learnt the identity of the person I would have to kill. "Do you remember what happened outside? The hot-headed suitor prepared to dispense summary justice on the street?" He nodded. "People change, Hightam." "Indeed. You have. You've been mainly preoccupied with your investigations into the first civilization," I said. "I'm so close now, Hightam," he said, as if the thought of it shrugged off a weary shroud he'd been wearing. "Were you ever able to decode Vedomir's journal?" He frowned. "No, worse luck. And not for want of trying, I can tell you. Or should I say, not yet? Because there is a code-breaker, an Italian assassin affiliate. A woman, would you believe? We have her at the French chateau, deep within the forest, but she says she needs her son to help her decode the book, and her son has been missing these past few years. Personally, I doubt what she says, and think she could very well decode the journal herself if she chose. I think she's using us to help reunite her with her son. But she has agreed to work on the journal if we locate him, and, finally, we have." "Where?" "Where you will soon be going to recover him. Corsica." So I'd been wrong. Not an assassination. A babysitting job. "What?" he said at the look on my face. "You think it below you?" "Quite the opposite, Hightam. This is the most important task I have ever given you." "No, Reginald," I sighed, "it's not. It simply appears that way in your thinking." "Oh? What are you saying?" "That perhaps your interest in this has meant you have neglected affairs elsewhere. Perhaps you have let certain other matters become out of control." Perplexed, he said, "What matters?" "Edward Braddock." He looked surprised. "I see. Well, is there something you want to tell me about him? Something you've been keeping from me?" I indicated for more ales, and our waitress brought them over, set them down with a smile, then walked away with her hips swaying. "What has Braddock told you of his movements in recent years?" I asked Reginald. "I have heard very little from him, seen him even less," he replied. In the last 6 years we've met just once, as far as I can recall, and his correspondences have become increasingly sporadic. He disapproves of my interest in those who came before, and unlike you, has not kept his objections to himself. It appears we differ greatly on how best to spread the Templar message. As a result, no, I know very little of him. In fact, if I wanted to know about Edward, I dare say I'd ask someone who has been with him during his campaigns. He gave a sardonic look. Where might I find such a person, do you think? You'd be a fool to ask me, I chortled. You know full well that where Braddock is concerned, I'm not an especially impartial observer. I began by disliking the man, and now like him even less. But in the absence of any more objective observations, here's mine. He has become a tyrant. How so? Cruelty, mainly. To the men suffering under him, but also to innocents. I've seen it with my own eyes for the first time in the Dutch Republic. How Edward treats his men is his business, said Reginald with a shrug. Men respond to discipline, Hightam, you know that. I shook my head. There was one particular incident, Reginald, on the last day of the siege. Reginald settled back to listen. Go on, as I continued. We were retreating. Dutch soldiers were shaking their fists at us, cursing King George for not sending more of his men to help relieve the fortress. Why more men had not arrived, I don't know. Would they have even made any difference? Again, I don't know. I'm not sure any of us who were stationed within those pentagonal walls knew how to contend with a French onslaught that was as committed as it was brutal, and as ruthless as it was sustained. Braddock had been right. The French had dug their parallel trench lines and begun their bombardment of the city, pressing close to the fortress walls, and they were on them by September, when they dug mines beneath the fortifications and destroyed them. We made attacks outside the walls to try to break the siege, all to no avail until, on 18th of September, the French broke through, at 4 in the morning, if memory serves. They caught the Allied forces quite literally napping, and we were overrun before we knew it. The French were slaughtering the entire garrison. We know, of course, that eventually they broke free of their command, and inflicted even worse damage on the poor inhabitants of that town. But the carnage had already begun. Edward had secured a skiff at the port, and had long since decided that were a day to come when the French broke through, he would use it to evacuate his men. That day had arrived. A band of us made our way to the port, where we began to oversee the loading of men and supplies onto the skiff. We kept a small force at the port walls to keep any marauding French troops back, while Edward, I, and others stood by the gangplank, overseeing the loading of men and supplies onto the skiff. We took some 1,400 men to the fortress at Bergen op Zoom, but the months of fighting had depleted numbers by about half. There was room on the skiff. Not lots of it. It wasn't as though we could have taken a great many passengers. Certainly not the numbers who needed to evacuate from the fortress. But there was space. I looked hard at Reginald. We could have taken them, is what I'm saying. Could have taken whom, Hightam? I took a long pull on my ale. There was a family who approached us on the port. Included in their number was an old man who could barely walk, as well as children. From among them came a young man who approached us and asked me if we had room on the boat. I nodded yes. I saw no reason why not, and indicated to Braddock. But instead of waving them aboard, as I expected, he held up a hand and ordered them off the port, beckoning his men to board the boat more quickly. The young man was as surprised as I was, and I opened my mouth to protest, but he got there before me. His face darkened, and he said something to Braddock that I didn't catch. It was obviously an insult of some kind. Braddock told me later that the insult was craven. Hardly the most insulting affront, certainly not worth what happened next, which was that Braddock drew his sword and plunged it into the young man where he stood. Braddock kept a small party of the men nearby at most times. His two regular companions were the executioner, Slater, and his assistant. His new assistant, I should say. I killed the old one. These men, you might almost have called them bodyguards. Certainly they were much closer to him than I was. Whether or not they had his ear I couldn't say, but they were fiercely loyal and protective, and were rushing forward even as the young man's body fell. They set about the family, Reginald, Braddock and these two of his men, and cut them down, every single one of them. The two men, an older woman, a younger woman, and of course the children. One of them an infant. One of them a babe in arms. I felt my jaw clench. It was a bloodbath, Reginald. The worst atrocity of war I have seen. I'm afraid I've seen a great many. He nodded gravely. I see. Naturally, this hardened your heart against Edward. I scoffed. Of course. Of course it has. We're all men of war, Reginald, but we are not barbarians. I see, I see. Do you? Do you see at last that Braddock is out of control? Steady on, Hightam. Out of control? The red mist descending is one thing. Out of control is quite another. He treats his men like slaves, Reginald. He shrugged. So? They're British soldiers. They expect to be treated like slaves. I think he's moving away from us. These men he has serving him, they're not Templars. They're free agents. Reginald nodded. The two men in the Black Forest, were these men part of Braddock's inner circle? I looked at him. I watched him very carefully as I lied. I don't know. There was a long pause, and to avoid meeting his eye, I took a long drink on my ale and pretended to admire the waitress, pleased to have the subject changed when Reginald at last leaned forward to give me more details of my forthcoming journey to Corsica. 2. Reginald and I parted outside White's and went to our carriages. When my carriage was some distance away, I tapped on the ceiling to stop, and my driver climbed down, looked left and right to check that nobody was watching, then opened the door and joined me inside. He sat opposite me and removed his hat, placing it to the seat beside him, and regarding me with bright, curious eyes. "Well, Master Hightam?" he said. I looked at him, took a deep breath, and stared out of the window. "I'm due to leave by sea tonight. We will return to Queen Anne's Square, where I will pack, then straight to the docks, if you would." He doffed an imaginary cap. "At your service, Mr. Kenway, sir. I'm getting quite used to this driving lark. Lots of waiting around, mind, could do without all that. But otherwise, well, at least you ain't got Frenchmen shooting at you, or your own officers shooting at you. In fact, I'd say the lack of blokes shooting at you is a real perk of the job." He could be quite tiresome sometimes. "Quite so, Holden," I said, with a frown that was intended to shut him up, although chance would be a fine thing. "Well, anyway, sir, did you learn anything?" "I'm afraid nothing concrete." I looked out of the window, wrestling with feelings of doubt, guilt, and disloyalty, wondering if there was anyone I truly trusted, anyone to whom I remained truly loyal now. Ironically, the person I trusted most was Holden. I had met him while in the Dutch Republic. Braddock had been as good as his word and allowed me to move among his men, asking them if they knew anything of the Tom Smith who had met his end on the scaffold. But I wasn't surprised when my investigations proved fruitless. No man I asked would even admit to knowing this Smith, if indeed Smith was his name. until one night I heard a movement at the door of my tent and sat up in my cot in time to see a figure appear. He was young, in his late 20s, with close-cropped, gingery hair and an easy, impish smile. This, it would turn out, was Private Jim Holden, a London man, a good man who wanted to see justice done. His brother had been one of those who had been hanged the same day I almost met my own end. He had been executed for the crime of stealing stew. That was all he had done, steal a bowlful of stew because he was starving. A flogging offence at worst, but they hanged him. His biggest mistake, it seemed, had been to steal the stew from one of Braddock's own men, one of his private mercenary force. This was what Holden had told me, that the 1,500-strong force of Coldstream Guards was made up mainly of British Army soldiers like himself, but that there was within that a smaller cadre of men personally selected by Braddock. Mercenaries. These mercenaries included Slater and his assistant, and, more worryingly, the 2 men who had ridden to the Black Forest. None of these men wore the ring of the order. They were thugs, strong-arms. I wondered why. Why Braddock chose men of this stripe for his inner circle and not Templar knights. The more time I'd spent with him, the more I thought I had my answer. He was moving away from the order. I looked back at Holden now. I had protested that night, but he was a man who had glimpsed the corruption at the heart of Braddock's organisation. He was a man who wanted to see justice for his brother, and as a result, no amount of my protesting made the slightest bit of difference. He was going to help me whether I liked it or not. I had agreed, but on the understanding that his assistance was kept secret at all times. In the hope of hoodwinking those who always seemed one step ahead of me, I needed it to appear as though I'd dropped the matter of finding my father's killers, so that they might no longer be one step ahead of me. Thus, when we left the Dutch Republic, Holden took on the title of my gentleman's gentleman, my driver, and to all intents and purposes, as far as the outside world was concerned, that's exactly what he was. Nobody knew that in fact he was carrying out investigations on my behalf. Not even Reginald knew that. Perhaps especially not Reginald. Holden saw the guilt written across my face. "Sir, it ain't lies you're telling Mr. Birch. All you're doing is what he's been doing, which is withholding certain bits of information, just until you've satisfied yourself that his name is clear. And I'm sure it will be, sir. I'm sure it will be, in being your oldest friend, sir." I wish I could share your optimism on the matter, Holden. I really do. Come, we should move on. My errand awaits. "Certainly, sir. And where is that errand taking you, may I ask?" "Corsica," I said. "I'm going to Corsica." "Ah, in the midst of a revolution, so I hear." "Quite right, Holden. A place of conflict is a perfect place to hide." "And what will you be doing there, sir?" "I'm afraid I can't tell you. Suffice to say, it has nothing to do with finding my father's killers, and is, therefore, of only peripheral interest to me. It's a job, a duty, nothing more. I hope that while I'm away you will continue your own investigations." "Oh, certainly, sir." "Excellent. And see to it that they remain covert." "Don't you be worrying about that, sir. As far as anybody is concerned, Master Kenway has long since abandoned his quest for justice. Whoever it is, sir, their guard will drop eventually." 25th of June, 1753. 1. It was hot on Corsica during the day, but at night the temperature dropped. Not too much, not freezing, but enough to make lying on a rock-strewn hillside with no blanket an uncomfortable experience. Cold as it was, though, there were even more pressing matters to attend to, such as the squad of Genoese soldiers moving up the hill, who I'd like to have said were moving stealthily. I'd like to have said that, but couldn't. At the top of the hill, on a plateau, was the farmhouse. I'd been keeping watch on it for the past 2 days, my spyglass trained on the doors and windows of what was a large building and a series of smaller barns and outbuildings, taking note of comings and goings. Rebels arriving with supplies and leaving with them too. While on the first day a small squad of them, I counted 8, had left the complex on what, when they returned, I realized had been some kind of attack. The Corsican rebels striking out against their Genoese masters. There were only 6 of them when they came back, and those 6 looked exhausted and bloodied, but nevertheless, without words or gestures, wore an aura of triumph. Women arrived with supplies not long afterwards, and there was celebration far into the night. This morning, more rebels had arrived with muskets wrapped in blankets. They were well equipped and had support, it seemed. It was no wonder the Genoese wanted to wipe this stronghold off the map. I had spent the 2 days moving around the hill so as to avoid being seen. The terrain was rocky, and I kept a safe distance away from the buildings. On the morning of the second day, however, I realized I had company. There was another man on the hill, another watcher. Unlike me, he had remained in the same position, dug into an outcrop of rocks, hidden by the brush and the skeletal trees that somehow survived on the otherwise parched hillside. 2. Lucio was the name of my target, and the rebels were hiding him. Whether they, too, were affiliates of the assassins, I had no idea, and it didn't matter anyway. He was the one I was after. A 21-year-old boy who was the key to solving a puzzle that has tormented poor Reginald for 6 years. An unprepossessing-looking boy, with shoulder-length hair, who, as far as I could tell from watching the farmhouse, helped out by carrying pails of water, feeding the livestock, and, yesterday, wringing the neck of a chicken. So he was there. That much I'd established. That was good. But there were problems. Firstly, he had a bodyguard. Never far away from him was a man who wore the gowns and cowl of an assassin. His gaze would often sweep the hillside while Lucio fetched water or scattered chicken feed. At his waist was a sword, and the fingers of his right hand would flex. Did he wear the famous hidden blade of the assassins, I wondered? No doubt he would. I'd have to beware of him, that much was for certain. Not to mention the rebels who were based at the farmhouse. The compound seemed to be crawling with them. One other thing to take into account. They were clearly planning to leave soon. Perhaps they'd been using the farmhouse as a temporary base for the attack. Perhaps they knew that the Genoese would soon be seeking revenge and come looking for them. Either way, they'd been moving supplies into the barns, no doubt piling carts high with them. My guess was that they would leave the next day. A nighttime incursion, then, would seem to be the answer, and it had to be tonight. This morning I managed to locate Lucio's sleeping quarters. He shared a medium-sized outhouse with the assassin and at least 6 other rebels. They had a code phrase they used when entering the quarters, and I read their lips through my spyglass. We work in the dark to serve the light. So, an operation that required some forethought, but no sooner was I preparing to retire from the hillside in order to concoct my plans than I saw the second man, and my plans changed. Edging closer to him, I had managed to identify him as a Genoese soldier. If I was right, that meant he was the forward party of men who would be attempting to take the stronghold. The rest would be along. When? Sooner, I thought, rather than later. They would want to exact swift revenge for the previous day's raid. Not only that, but they would want to be seen to be reacting quickly to the rebels. Tonight, then. So I left him. I let him continue his surveillance and, instead of withdrawing, stayed on the hillside concocting a different plan. My new plan involved Genoese troops. The observation man had been good. He'd stayed out of sight and then, when dark fell, retreated stealthily, noiselessly, back down the hill. Where, I wondered, was the rest of the force? Not far away. And an hour or so later I began to notice movement at the bottom of the hill, and even at one point heard a muffled curse in Italian. By this stage I was about halfway up, and realizing that they would soon begin to advance, I moved even closer to the plateau and the fence of an animal enclosure. Maybe 50 yards away I could see one of the sentries. Last night they'd had 5 altogether, around the entire perimeter of the farmyard. Tonight they would no doubt increase the guard. I took out my spyglass and trained it on the nearest guard, who stood, silhouetted by the moon at his back, diligently scanning the hillside below him. Of me, he would see nothing, just another irregular shape in a landscape of irregular shapes. No wonder they were deciding to move so quickly after their ambush. It wasn't the most secure hideout I'd ever seen. In fact, they'd have been sitting ducks were it not for the fact that the approaching Genoese soldiers were so damned clumsy. The conduct of their observation man flattered the operation as a whole. These were men to whom stealth was clearly a foreign and unfamiliar idea, and I was beginning to hear more and more noise from the bottom of the hill. The rebels were almost certain to hear them next, and if the rebels heard them, they would have more than enough opportunity to make their escape, and if the rebels made their escape, they would take Lucio with them. So I decided to lend a hand. Each guard had responsibility for a pie slice of the farmyard. Thus, the one nearest to me would move slowly back and forth across a distance of about 25 yards. He was good. He made sure that even while he was scanning one section of his area, the rest of it was never fully out of sight. But he was also on the move, and when he was, I had a precious few seconds in which to move closer. So I did, bit by bit, until I was close enough to see the guard. His bushy, grey beard, his hat with the brim covering eyes like dark shadows, and his musket slung over his shoulder. And while I couldn't see or hear the marauding Genoese soldiers yet, I was aware of them, and soon he would be too. I could only assume that the same scene was being played out on the other side of the hill, which meant I had to work fast. I drew my short sword and readied myself. I felt sorry for the guard and offered up a silent apology. He had done nothing to me but be a good and diligent guard, and he did not deserve to die. And then, there on the rocky hillside, I paused. For the first time in my life, I doubted my ability to go through with it. I thought of the family on the port, cut down by Braddock and his men. 7 senseless deaths. And all of a sudden I was struck by the conviction that I was no longer prepared to add to the death toll. I couldn't put this guard, who was no enemy of mine, to the sword. I couldn't do it. The hesitation almost cost me dear, because at that same moment the clumsiness of the Genoese soldiers finally made its presence felt, and there were the sounds of clattering rock and a curse from further down the hill that was carried on the night air, first to my ears, then to the sentry. His head jerked, and straight away he was reaching for his musket, craning his neck as he strained his eyes, staring down the hill. He saw me. For a second our eyes locked. My moment of hesitation was over, and I sprang, covering the distance between us in one leap. I led with my empty right hand outstretched in a claw, and my sword held in my left. As I landed, I grabbed the back of his head with my right hand and plunged the sword into his throat. He had been about to alert his comrades, but the shout died to a gurgle as blood gushed over my hand and down his front. Holding his head secure with my right hand, I embraced him, then lowered him gently and noiselessly to the dry dirt of the farmyard. I crouched. About 60 yards away was the second guard. He was a dim figure in the dark, but I could see that he was about to turn, and when he did, he was likely to spot me. I ran, so fast that for a moment I could hear the rush of the night, and caught him just as he turned. Again I took the back of the man's neck with my right hand and slammed the sword into him. Again the man was dead before he hit the dirt. From further down the hill I heard more noise from the Genoese assault troop, which was blissfully unaware that I had prevented their advance being heard. Sure enough, though, their comrades on the other side had been just as inept, and without a Kenway guardian angel, had been heard by the sentries on their side. Straight away the cry went up, and in moments lights were being lit in the farmhouse, and rebels were pouring out, carrying lit torches, pulling boots on over their breeches, dragging jackets across their backs, and passing each other swords and muskets. As I crouched, watching, I saw the doors to a barn thrown open, and 2 men begin pulling out a cart by hand, already piled high with supplies, while another hurried across with a horse. The time for stealth was over, and the Genoese soldiers on all sides knew it, abandoning their attempts to storm the farm quietly, and rushing up the hill towards the farmyard with a shout. I had an advantage. I was already in the farmyard. Plus, I was not in the uniform of a Genoese soldier, and in the confusion I was able to move among the running rebels without attracting suspicion. I moved towards the outhouse where Lucio was quartered, and almost ran into him as he came darting out. His hair was untied, but otherwise he was dressed, and he was calling to another man, exhorting him to make his way to the barn. Not far away was the assassin, who ran, pulling his robes across his chest, and pulling his sword at the same time. 2 Genoese raiders appeared around the side of the outhouse, and straight away he engaged them, calling back over his shoulder, "Lucio, run for the barn!" Excellent. Just what I wanted. The assassin's attention diverted. Just then I saw another trooper come running onto the plateau, crouch, raise his musket, and take aim. Lucio, holding the torch, was his target. But the soldier didn't get a chance to fire before I had darted over and was upon him before he even saw me. He gave a single, muted cry as I buried my sword hilt deep in the back of his neck. "Lucio!" I yelled, and at the same time jogged the dead man's trigger finger so that the musket discharged, but harmlessly, into the air. Lucio stopped, shielding his eyes to look across the yard, where I made a show of tossing away the limp corpse of the soldier. Lucio's companion ran on, which was just what I wanted. Some distance away the assassin was still fighting, and for a second I admired his skills as he fended off the 2 men at the same time. "Thank you," called Lucio. "Wait," I responded. "We've got to get out of here before the farmyard's overrun." He shook his head. "I need to make my way to the cart," he called. "Thank you again, friend." Then he turned and darted off. Damn. I cursed and took off in the direction of the barn, running parallel to him, but out of sight in the shadows. To my right I saw a Genoese raider about to come off the hillside and into the yard, and was close enough to see his eyes widen as our gaze met. Before he could react, I'd grabbed his arm, span, and thrust my sword into his armpit, just above his chest-plate, and let him fall screaming backwards to the rock, snatching his torch at the same time. I kept going, staying parallel with Lucio, making sure he was out of danger. I reached the barn just ahead of him. As I passed by, still in the shadows, I could see inside the still-open front doors, where 2 rebels were tethering a horse to the cart while 2 stood guard, one firing his musket, while the other reloaded, then knelt to fire. I continued running, then darted close to the wall of the barn, where I found a Genoese soldier about to let himself in through a side door. I thrust the sword blade upwards at the base of his spine. For a second he writhed in agony, impaled on the blade, and I shoved his body through the door ahead of me, tossed the lit torch into the back of the cart, and stayed back in the shadows. "Get them!" I called, in what I hoped was an approximation of the voice and accent of a Genoese soldier. "Get the rebel scum!" Then, "The cart's ablaze!" I shouted, this time in what I hoped was an approximation of the voice and accent of a Corsican rebel. And at the same time I moved forward out of the shadows, clasping my Genoese corpse, and let him drop as though he were a fresh kill. "The cart's ablaze!" I repeated, and now turned my attention to Lucio, who had just arrived at the barn. "We've got to get out of here. Lucio, come with me." I saw two of the rebels exchange a confused look, each wondering who I was, and what I wanted with Lucio. There was the report of musket fire, and wood splintered around us. One of the rebels fell, a musket ball embedded in his eye, and I dived on the other one, pretending to shield him from the musket fire, but punching the knife blade into his heart at the same time. It was Lucio's companion, I realized, as he died. "He's gone," I said to Lucio, rising. "No!" he shouted, tearful already. No wonder they'd considered him fit only for feeding livestock, I thought, if he was going to dissolve into tears the first time a comrade was killed in action. By now the barn was ablaze around us. The other two rebels, seeing that there was nothing they could salvage, made their escape and ran pell-mell across the yard towards the hillside, melting into the dark. Other rebels were making their escape, and across the yard I saw that Genoese soldiers had put torches to farm buildings as well. "I must wait for Miko," called Lucio. I gambled that Miko was his assassin bodyguard. "He's otherwise engaged. He asked me, a fellow member of the Brotherhood, to take care of you." "Are you sure?" "A good assassin questions everything," I said. "Miko has taught you well. But now is not the time for lessons in the tenets of our creed. We must go." He shook his head. "Tell me the code phrase," he said firmly. "Freedom to choose." And at last I seemed to have established enough trust to persuade Lucio to come with me, and we began to make our way down the hillside, me gleeful, thanking God that at last I had him not so sure. Suddenly he stopped. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I can't do it. I can't leave Miko." Great, I thought. "He said to go," I replied, "and to meet him at the bottom of the ravine where our horses are tethered." Behind us at the farmyard, the fires raged on, and I could hear the remnants of the battle. The Genoese soldiers were clearing up the last of the rebels. Not far away was the sound of a clattering stone, and I saw other figures in the darkness, a pair of rebels escaping. Lucio saw them too, and went to call to them, but I clamped a hand over his mouth. "No, Lucio," I whispered. "The soldiers will be after them." His eyes were wide. "These are my comrades. They're my friends. I need to be with them. We need to ensure that Miko is safe." From high above us drifted the sound of pleading and screaming, and Lucio's eyes darted as though trying to deal with the conflict in his head. Did he help his friends above, or join those escaping? Either way, I could see he had decided that he didn't want to be with me. "Stranger," he began, and I thought, stranger now, eh? "I thank you for all that you've done to help me, and I hope that we can meet again in happier circumstances, and perhaps when I can express my gratitude even more thoroughly. But at the moment I'm needed with my people." He stood up to go. With a hand on his shoulder, I brought him down to my level again. He pulled away with his jaw set. "Now, Lucio," I said, "listen. I've been sent by your mother to take you to her." At this, he reared back. "Oh, no," he said. "No, no, no!" Which wasn't the reaction I'd been expecting. I had to scramble across rock to catch him up, but he began to fight me off. "No, no," he said. "I don't know who you are, just leave me alone." "Oh, for the love of God," I said, and silently admitted defeat as I grabbed him in a sleeper hold, ignoring his struggles and applying pressure, restricting the flow of his carotid artery. Not enough to cause him permanent damage, but enough to render him unconscious. And as I threw him over my shoulder, a tiny slip of a thing he was, and carried him down the hill, careful to avoid the last pockets of rebels fleeing the Genoese attack, I wondered why I hadn't simply knocked him out in the first place. 3. I stopped at the ravine edge and lowered Lucio to the floor, then found my rope, secured it, and lowered it into the darkness below. Next, I used Lucio's belt to tie his hands, looped the other end under his thighs, and tied it so that his limp body was slung across my back. Then I began the slow climb down. About halfway down, the weight became unbearable, but it was an eventuality I'd prepared for, and I managed to hang on until I reached an opening in the cliff face that led into a dark cave. I scrambled in and pulled Lucio off my back, feeling my muscles relax gratefully. From ahead of me, in the cave, came a noise. A movement at first, like a shifting sound, and then a click. The sound an assassin's hidden blade makes when it is engaged. "I knew you'd come here," said a voice that belonged to Miko, the assassin. "I knew you'd come here because that's what I would have done." And then he struck, came shooting forward from within the cave, using my shock and surprise against me. I was already drawing my short sword and had it out as we clashed, his blade slicing at me like a claw, and meeting my sword with such force that it was knocked out of my hand, sent skittering to the lip of the cave, and into the blackness below. My sword. My father's sword. But there was no time to mourn it, for the assassin was coming at me a second time, and he was good. Very good. In a confined space, with no weapon, I had no chance. All I had, in fact, was luck. And luck is all it was that as I pressed myself against the cave wall, he had miscalculated slightly, enough to overbalance a fraction. In any other circumstances, against any other opponent, he would have recovered immediately and finished his kill. But this wasn't any other circumstances, and I wasn't any other opponent, and I made him pay for his tiny error. I leaned into him, grabbed his arm, twisted, and helped him on his way so that he too sailed out into the blackness. But he held on, pulled me with him, dragged me to the edge of the cave so that I was screaming in pain as I tried to stop myself being dragged out into open space. Lying flat on my belly, I looked out and saw him, one arm grabbing mine, the other trying to reach for the rope. I could feel the brace of his hidden blade, brought my other hand forward, and began fumbling with the fastenings. Too late he realized what I was doing, and abandoned trying to catch hold of the rope, instead focusing his efforts on trying to stop me unfastening the brace. For some moments, our hands flapped at each other for possession of the blade, which, as I opened the first catch, suddenly slipped further up his wrist and sent him lurching to one side, his position even more precarious than before, his other arm pinwheeling. It was all I needed, and with a final shout of effort I unclipped the last fastening, wrenched the brace free, and at the same time bit into the hand that gripped my wrist. A combination of pain and lack of traction was enough to dislodge him at last. I saw him swallowed up by the dark and prayed he wouldn't hit my horse when he landed. But nothing came. No sound of a landing. Nothing. The next thing I saw was the rope, taut and quivering. And I craned my neck, strained my eyes to search the darkness, and was rewarded by the sight of Miko some distance below, very much alive, and beginning to climb up towards me. I pulled his blade to me and held it to the rope. "If you climb much higher, the fall will kill you when I cut the rope," I called. He was already close enough so that I could look into his eyes when he stared up at me, and I could see the indecision in them. "You shouldn't suffer such a death, friend," I added. "Start your descent, and live to fight another day." I began to saw slowly at the rope, and he stopped, looked down into the dark, where the bottom of the ravine was not in sight. "You have my blade," he said. "To the victor the spoils," I shrugged. "Perhaps we will meet again," he said, "and I can reclaim it." "I sense that only one of us will survive a second meeting," I said. He nodded. "Perhaps," he said, and soon had shimmied down into the night. The fact that I now had to climb back up and had been forced to surrender my horse was awkward, but rather that than face the assassin again. And for now, we are resting. Well, I am resting. Poor Lucio remains unconscious. Later, I will hand him over to associates of Reginald, who will take him in a covered wagon, make the passage across the Mediterranean to the south of France, and then to the chateau, where Lucio will be reunited with his mother, the Codebreaker. Then I'll charter a ship to Italy, being sure to be seen doing it, referring to my young companion once or twice. If and when the assassins come looking for Lucio, that's where they'll concentrate their efforts. Reginald says I'm no longer needed after that. I am to melt away in Italy, leave no trace, no trail to follow. 12th of August, 1753. 1. I began the day in France, having doubled back from Italy. No small undertaking. It's all very well writing it down, but one doesn't simply double back from Italy to France. My reason for being in Italy was to misdirect the assassins when they came looking for Lucio. So, by returning to France, to the very place where we were holding Lucio and his mother, I was endangering not just my recently accomplished mission, but everything Reginald had been working for these past years. It was risky. It was so risky, in fact, that if I thought about it, the risk took my breath away. It made me wonder, was I stupid? What kind of fool would take such a risk? And the answer was, a fool with doubt in his heart. 2. 100 yards or so from the gate, I came upon a lone patrol, a guard dressed as a peasant, with a musket slung across his back, who looked sleepy, but was alert and watchful. As we drew up to him, our eyes met for a moment. His flickered briefly as he recognized me, and he jerked his head slightly to let me know I was free to pass. There would be another patrol, I knew, on the other side of the chateau. We came out of the forest and followed the tall perimeter wall until we came to a large, arched wooden gate, inset with a smaller wicket gate, where a guard stood, a man I recognized from my years spent at the chateau. "Well, well," he said, "if it isn't Master Hightam, all grown up." He grinned and took the reins of my horses as I dismounted, before opening the wicket gate, which I stepped through, blinking in the sudden sunlight after the comparative gloom of the forest. Ahead of me stretched the chateau lawn, and walking across it I felt a strange crawling sensation in my belly that I knew to be nostalgia for the time I had spent at this chateau in my youth, when Reginald had continued my father's teachings? He'd said so. But of course I now know he'd been misleading me about that. In the ways of combat and stealth, perhaps he had done so, But Reginald had raised me in the ways of the Templar Order, and taught me that the way of the Templar was the only way, and that those who believed in another way were at best misguided, at worst evil. But I'd since learnt that Father was one of those misguided, evil people, and who's to say what he would have taught me as I grew up? Who's to say? The grass was straggly and overgrown, despite the presence of 2 gardeners, both of whom wore short swords at their waists, hands going to the hilts as I made my way towards the front door of the chateau. I came close to one of them, who, when he saw who I was, nodded his head. "An honour finally to meet you, Master Kenway," he said. "I trust your mission was successful." "It was, thank you, yes," I replied to the guard, or gardener, whatever he was. To him I was a knight, one of the most celebrated in the order. Could I really hate Reginald when his stewardship had brought me such acclaim? And after all, had I ever doubted his teachings? The answer was no. Had I been forced to follow them? Again, no. I'd always had the option to choose my own path, but had stayed with the Order because I believed in the code. Even so, he has lied to me. No, not lied to me. How had Holden put it? Withheld the truth. Why? And more immediately, why had Lucio reacted that way when I told him he was to see his mother? At the mention of my name, the second gardener looked at me more sharply. Then he too was genuflecting as I made my way past, acknowledging him with a nod, feeling taller all of a sudden, and all but puffing out my chest as I approached the front door that I knew so well. I turned before I knocked, to look back across the lawn, where the 2 guards stood watching me. I had trained on that lawn, spent countless hours honing my sword skills. I knocked, and the door was opened by yet another similarly attired man who also wore a short sword at his waist. The chateau had never been this fully staffed when I had lived there, but then again, when I lived there we never had a guest as important as the code-breaker. The first familiar face I saw belonged to John Harrison, who looked at me, then did a double-take. "Hightam," he blustered. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Hello, John," I said equably. "Is Reginald here?" "Well, yes, Hightam, but Reginald is supposed to be here. What are you doing here?" "I came to check on Lucio." "You what?" Harrison was becoming somewhat red-faced. "You came to check on Lucio." He was having trouble finding his words now. "What? Why? What on earth do you think you're doing?" "John," I said gently, "please calm yourself. I was not followed from Italy. Nobody knows I'm here." "Well, I should bloody well hope not." "Where's Reginald?" "Below stairs with the prisoners." "Oh? Prisoners?" "Monica and Lucio." "I see. I had no idea they were considered prisoners." But a door had opened beneath the stairs, and Reginald appeared. I knew that door. It led down to the cellar, which, when I lived there, was a dank, low-ceilinged room with mouldering, mainly empty wine racks along one side, and a dark, damp wall along the other. "Hello, Hightam," said Reginald, tight-lipped. "You were not expected." Not far away lingered one of the guards, and now he was joined by another. I looked from them back to Reginald and John, who stood like a pair of concerned clergymen. Neither was armed, but even if they had been, I thought I could probably take all 4. If it came to it. "Indeed," I said. "John was just telling me how surprised he was by my visit." "Well, quite. You've been very reckless, Hightam." "Perhaps. but I wanted to see that Lucio was being looked after. Now I'm told he's a prisoner here, so perhaps I have my answer." Reginald chortled. "Well, what did you expect?" "What I was told. That the mission was to reunite mother and son, that the Codebreaker had agreed to work on Vedamir's journal if we were able to rescue her son from the rebels. I told you no lies, Hightam. Indeed, Monica has been working on decoding the journal since being reunited with Lucio." "Just not on the basis I imagined." "The carrot doesn't work. We use the stick," said Reginald, his eyes cold. "I'm sorry if you had formed the impression that there was more carrot than stick involved." "Let's see her," I said, and with a short nod, Reginald agreed. He turned and led us through the door, which opened onto a flight of stone steps leading down. Light danced on the walls. "Regarding the journal, we're close now, Hightam," he said as we descended. "So far, we've been able to establish that there exists an amulet. Somehow it fits with the storehouse. If we can get hold of the amulet—" At the bottom of the steps, iron cressets on poles had been set out to light the way to a door, where a guard stood. He moved to one side and opened the door for us to pass through. Inside, the cellar was as I remembered it, lit by the flickering light of torches. At one end was a desk. It was bolted to the floor, and Lucio was manacled to it. And beside him was his mother, who was an incongruous sight. She sat on a chair that looked as though it had been brought into the cellar from upstairs especially for the purpose. She was wearing long skirts and a buttoned-up blouse, and would have looked like a churchgoer were it not for the rusting iron restraints around her wrists and the arms of the chair, and especially the scold's bridle around her head. Lucio swivelled in his seat, saw me, and his eyes burned with hatred. Then he turned back to his work. I had stopped in the middle of the floor, halfway between the door and the Codebreakers. "Reginald, what is the meaning of this?" I said, pointing at Lucio's mother, who regarded me balefully from within the scold's bridle. "The Branks is temporary, Hightam. Monica has been somewhat vocal in her condemnation of our tactics this morning. Hence we have moved them here for the day." He raised his voice to address the Codebreakers. "I'm sure they can return to their usual residence tomorrow when they have recovered their manners." "This is not right, Reginald." "Their usual quarters are much more pleasant, Hightam," he assured me, testily. "Even so, they should not be treated this way." "Neither should the poor child in the Black Forest have been scared half to death with your blade at his throat," snapped Reginald. I started, my mouth working, but lost for words. That was different? Because it involved your quest to find your father's killers. Hightam. He took my elbow and led me out of the cellar, and back out into the corridor, and we began to climb the steps again. "This is even more important than that. You may not think so, but it is. It involves the entire future of the Order." I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure what was more important, but said nothing. "And what happens when the decoding is over?" I asked, as we reached the entrance hall once again. He looked at me. "Oh no," I said, understanding. "Neither is to be harmed." "Hightam, I don't much care for you giving me orders." "Then don't think of it as an order," I hissed. "Think of it as a threat. Keep them here when their work is over, if you must. But if they are harmed, then you will have me to answer to." He looked at me long and hard. I realized that my heart was hammering, and hoped to God it wasn't somehow visible. Had I ever gone against him like this? With such force? I didn't think so. Very well, he said after a moment. They will not be harmed. We spent dinner in near silence, and the offer of a bed for the night was made reluctantly. I leave in the morning. Reginald promises to be in touch with news concerning the journal. The warmth between us, though, is gone. In me he sees insubordination. In him I see lies. 18th of April, 1754. 1. Earlier this evening I found myself at the Royal Opera House, taking a seat next to Reginald, who was settling in for a performance of The Beggar's Opera with evident glee. Of course, the last time we'd met I'd threatened him, which wasn't something I had forgotten. But evidently he had. Forgotten or forgiven. One of the two. Either way, it was as though the confrontation had never taken place, the slate wiped clean either by his anticipation of the night's forthcoming entertainment, or by the fact that he believed the amulet to be near. It was inside the opera house, in fact, around the neck of an assassin who had been named in Vedemir's journal, then tracked down by Templar agents. An assassin. He was my next target. My first job since rescuing Lucio in Corsica, and the first to feel the bite of my new weapon, my hidden blade. As I took the opera glasses and looked at the man across the hall, my target, the irony of it suddenly struck me. My target was Miko. I left Reginald in his seat and made my way along the corridors of the opera house, along the back of the seats, past the opera's patrons, until I found myself at the stalls. At the box where Miko sat, I let myself in silently, then tapped him gently on the shoulder. I was ready for him if he tried anything, but though his body tensed, and I heard him give a sharp intake of breath, he made no move to defend himself. It was almost as though he expected it when I reached and took the amulet from his neck. And did I sense a feeling of relief? As though he were grateful to relinquish the responsibility, pleased no longer to be its custodian. "You should have come to me," he sighed. "We would have found another way." "Yes, but then you would have known," I replied. There was a click as I engaged the blade, and I saw him smile, knowing it was the one I had taken from him in Corsica. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," I told him. "As am I," he said, and I killed him. 2. Some hours later, I attended the meeting at the house on Fleet and Bride, standing around a table with others, our attention focused on Reginald as well as the book on the table before us. It was open, and I could see the symbol of the assassins on the page. "Gentlemen," said Reginald. His eyes were shining, as though he were close to tears. "I hold in my hand a key, and if this book is to be believed, it will open the doors of a storehouse built by those who came before." I contained myself. "Ah, our dear friends who ruled, ruined, and then vanished from the world," I said. "Do you know what it is we'll find within?" If Reginald picked up on my sarcasm, then he made no sign. Instead, he reached for the amulet, held it up, and basked in the hush from those assembled as it began to glow in his hand. It was impressive, even I had to admit, and Reginald looked over at me. "It could contain knowledge," he replied. "Perhaps a weapon, or something as of yet unknown, unfathomable in its construction and purpose. It could be any of these things, or none of them. They are still an enigma, these precursors, But of one thing I am certain. Whatever waits behind those doors shall prove a great boon to us. Or our enemies, I said, should they find it first. He smiled. Was I beginning to believe at last? They won't. You've seen to that. Mika had died wanting to find another way. What had he meant? An accord of assassin and Templar? My thoughts went to my father. I assume you know where this storehouse is, I said, after a pause. Mr. Harrison, said Reginald, and John stepped forward with a map, unfurling it. How fare your calculations, said Reginald, as John circled an area of the map which, leaning closer, I saw contained New York and Massachusetts. I believe the site lays somewhere within this region, he said. That's a lot of ground to cover, I frowned. My apologies. Would that I could be more accurate. That's all right, said Reginald. It suffices for a start. And this is why we've called you here, Master Kenway. We'd like for you to travel to America, locate the storehouse, and take possession of its contents. I'm yours to command, I said. To myself, I cursed him and his folly, and wished I could be left alone to continue my own investigations, then added, although a job of this magnitude will require more than just myself. Of course, said Reginald, and handed me a piece of paper. Here are the names of 5 men sympathetic to our cause. Each is also uniquely suited to aid you in your endeavour. With them at your side, you'll want for nothing. Well, then I'd best be on my way, I said. I knew our faith in you was not misplaced. We've booked you a passage to Boston. Your ship leaves at dawn. Go forth, Hightam, and bring honour to us all.